Hi, everyone. Welcome to our week 2 meeting. We're going to be talking about close reading, interpretation through analysis. We're going to start by talking about how we can discover meaning by looking closely at a text. So we can think of close reading as a thoughtful, disciplined reading of a specific text. And in the discussion board, I've seen some really good conversation about sometimes picking up a novel and just reading for fun. And we often do the same thing if we read the newspapers or if we're scrolling through Facebook. Um, in reality, we read a lot every day, but we don't usually take the time to slow down and look for meaning. However, when we are working to interpret a text and find what's in between the lines, that's when we have to do an intentional, disciplined reading. So the goal of close reading is to really unpack the text. And I'd like to give this metaphor for you guys to think about. If you think about a book as compared to a closed suitcase, you know that inside of the suitcase there are likely many different items. There's going to be pants and shirts and undergarments and possibly a blow dryer, maybe some toiletries, possibly a pair of shoes. You don't know what's inside of it until you open it. And even once you open it, you're only seeing superficially what's on the top. You don't really know what's inside and what the person who owns a suitcase might be like until you actually start unpacking it and going through each of the individual items. So the same is true of a piece of writing that we're reading. We can figure a little bit out by looking sometimes at the cover or reading the back of the book, maybe getting our hands on a summary. And even by opening the book and skimming through, we can start to get a feel for what it might be like. But without taking our time and slowly going through and unpacking the different elements of a book, we can't truly know what the meaning is. So when we unpack a text, there's usually some certain
Our
features
first day
that
of
we want
class
to
is
linger
Monday,
over.
August 26th, but feel free to get
Elements
started
of fiction,
anytime.
that's what we covered
And have a
during
great
week
first
one,
week
our
back.
plot, our conflicts, the setting and character, all of those things. In a close reading, you will pay very careful attention to all of those items. They might not always be important. In the week one reading, it talked about how sometimes the setting can really define an entire work of fiction. Other times, the setting is never even given. A good example is in The Lottery that we just read. We know that it's in a town and we know that it's being held in between the bank and the post office, but outside of that, we don't know anything else. We don't know if this was set a long, long time ago, back in the 1800s, or if it is something that happened in the 1900s. There's no description of what the surrounding land looks like, or even what the buildings look like. We don't know if there's cars driving around or anything else. So, in a piece of work like The Lottery, the setting's not important. And sometimes the lack of setting can mean something, but we can't figure that out until we start looking at all the other elements and how they work together. Another thing that you'll pay close attention to is patterns. So patterns could be repetition, or we continually see a certain symbol that keeps reappearing chapter after chapter, or in a smaller work, paragraph after paragraph. It's really important to notice patterns. And if you see something twice, that means it could be a pattern. So we want to note those things and then be on the lookout for them. Rhetorical devices are another thing that we want to take our time with and try to locate and then decipher. And we're going to talk a little bit about examples of rhetorical advice devices in just a minute. And really, we do this process line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and then even chapter by chapter within a larger piece to explore the significance of everything that we find on different levels. And that's really where the difficult work comes in. It's easy enough to read a paragraph and try to understand what it means on a surface level. But when we try to find the hidden meaning or what's stated between the lines in multiple paragraphs and on multiple pages and chapters, that's when it becomes really important to have a record of what you found. And we talked a little bit about that in week one, observing your reactions and making sure to notice how you feel and the different parts of the reading that you notice. You maybe write it down on paper. And in your reading for week two, they are even a little bit more explicit, telling you ways that you can diagram your observations and different questions that you can ask in order to try to unpack what you're reading to the extreme, essentially. So let's talk for a second about rhetorical devices. I want to just give this overview, and for some of you, I'm sure it'll be a review, and for others, it may be new information. But rhetoric is defined as the art of using language. And this is a very, very old concept dating back to the time of Aristotle. And this is when it was considered you were pretty much a celebrity if you were a very good public speaker. And you can see in the picture, it's actually a book cover that's on the screen in front of you here. There's a man standing on the stage, and he's surrounded by people who are just listening to him. So, great speakers back then, they were the celebrities of their time because that was considered the ultimate skill. If you were able to speak to a group effectively and win their favor, that was the highest level that you could achieve. So that concept really has kind of traveled down over the years, over the centuries, and it's still very, very powerful. We see rhetoric at work in politics when we are watching TV and those commercials come over in between our shows, and they're talking about, how terrible candidate A is because he's cut funding for this and that. And in the meantime, on the screen, we've got pictures of sad children who can't go to school. So that's playing on our sense of emotion and trying to make us angry. On the other hand, politicians can make very successful arguments to get other congressmen to vote for a certain bill that they want to pass. And they do that using words, nothing but words. And we also see this present in courtrooms. So lawyers' main tool outside of evidence, obviously, is the words that they're using because they're trying to make an impact on the jury. So their word choices and their tone of voice are very important in terms of trying to convince the jury to vote the way that they want them to vote at the end of the trial. So within rhetoric, we have two main components, the rhetorical situation and then rhetorical strategies. The rhetorical situation is when the writer asks questions before they begin to write or as they are writing. And those questions are things like, what is my message or purpose? So, what do I want to achieve with this piece of writing? What lesson do I want to teach? Who is my audience? So, who am I directing this message to? Is it single parents between the ages of 20 and 35? Is it high school graduates? Is it high school dropouts? There's really any range of audience members that a writer might have in mind when they're writing something. Of course, the writing might be read by anyone in the world, but typically a writer has got a specific audience in mind that they're trying to communicate that message to. And then they're asking, how do I want my writing to make them feel, or what do I want my writing to make them do? And then, of course, writers can choose their medium and their genre. So they can choose if they're going to write a short novel or a 5-page story. They can choose if they want to sell their story to a TV company and have it produced visually. They can have it recorded so that it can be an audible book. So there's lots of different genres and mediums that writers can choose to get their work out there. And once they have at least somewhat decent answers to all of these questions, then they can begin the work of crafting and creating the writing that they want to do. And the answers to those questions are going to guide the decisions that the writers make. So, what is the best word choice to convey the message given who my audience is? How much description will I include? And that's kind of a big one because some writers give a great deal of description, allowing us to paint images in our mind. Other writers don't give a lot of description at all. So we are kind of left to our own devices to decide what a character might look like or what a house or a room or even a city or a town might look like. And that's always an intentional choice. So if we're getting a lot of detail, that's because the writer wants to make sure that we know where the setting is, what it looks like, and something about that detail is probably important and plays a role in the theme. On the other hand, if we are not getting a lot of detail, it could be because the writer's trying to say, this could happen anywhere. This is relevant to every person in every generation. The setting is irrelevant, and that's an important observation as well. Another example question that, or a decision, another question that a author might be able to answer based on asking the first set of questions is, when should I reveal certain information? So how long will I keep the reader in suspense, or will I not keep them in suspense at all? Will they know the answer from the beginning and I'll work backward? So the organization of a story, whether it's going to be chronological or whether it will have flashbacks, all of those things are decisions that writers have to make based on what it is they're trying to do. And all of that coming together is rhetoric. And as I'm sure most of you guys will agree, as we've been talking about writing and fiction, it really is an art form, and it really is intentional every bit as much as a painter with a brush in their hand working to create an image. That's exactly what writers are doing, but with words. So a couple of rhetorical devices here: description, analogies and metaphors, alliteration, diction, symbols, sentence length, dialogue. All of these things are the tools that writers have at their disposal to get their writing to do what it is they want it to do, to get that intentional message across in the way they want it to go, and to have the reader feeling a certain way. I included a link down here where it says more examples, and I'm going to upload the PowerPoint for you guys so that you can click on the link. And there are literally hundreds of rhetorical devices that writers use. And you can use these tools as well when you're working on your homework, or if you're, writing up something even outside of school, you're asking for a raise. Using rhetorical devices can be persuasive. That's the entire point. You'll see the very last one on this list is word choice. And I have a little extra note there that says denotation and connotation. So we're just going to take a second to talk about that. And the reason why is because word choice is hugely important, especially in fiction. It's never an accident. The words are chosen with precision in order to generate a certain feeling or to lead a reader in a certain way. So we want to know the difference between denotation and connotation and how they're used. So we'll start with denotation, and that is the literal meaning of a word. It starts with a D, so I always think of it as the dictionary meaning. It's literally, you can open up the dictionary, and that's the denotation. So the example I have here is small. The definition is of a size that is less than normal. And that's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. We are not making any associations really with the word small. However, I have another set of words here that also mean small, but there's connotations associated with those words. So connotation is the meaning that usually society has placed on a word, or it might come from you. You might have a certain association with a word because it's been used in a certain way in your own life experience. And I'm going to illustrate that for you here. So another word for small could be slender. Slender, generally speaking, has a positive connotation. So, on one hand, we could say that woman is small, and we don't really think anything of it. If we say the woman is slender, we think, okay, that's attractive, right? Slender is thought of as a positive, attractive body type. And I have the image there just to show, something that is kind of stereotypically a positive, slender image. Then we have a couple more words, little and skinny, and these also mean small. These don't carry a whole lot of connotation, negative or positive. Maybe as we go down this list to skinny, that could be taken maybe negatively. A woman may not want to be called skinny. She might take that offensive. And then the last two words here, thin and rail thin. So you can see where we've kind of gone down the ladder, starting off with a more positive image with the word slender, and then going down to thin or rail thin. And then that image there on the right is showing someone who looks much too thin. You can see her ribs, and people are trying to shove food in her face. So using a word like rail thin, so to say that woman is rail thin, that carries with it a negative connotation, meaning that you're saying, gosh, there's something wrong with her. She shouldn't be that thin. So if we say the woman is slender, or we say the woman is rail thin, either way we mean that she's small, but by choosing the word slender or rail thin, we are implying a positive or negative stereotype along with it. And those are the types of choices that can help you discover where the writer is trying to leave you and how they want you to think. So now, moving on, at the beginning of this meeting, we started out with the idea of discovering meaning and realizing that to do that, we have to pay attention to all of these different elements and choices and parts of the work that we're reading. Paying attention to all of these items, these are the ones that we've talked about, is half the battle. Once we have paid attention to these things and made notes about them and also noted our reactions and our additional thoughts and observations, then we've got a whole bunch of pieces, and the work of interpretation or analysis is repacking those pieces. And I'm going back to the suitcase metaphor here. You can see the suitcase on the left is kind of a mess. Everything is jumbled, it's just thrown back in. The suitcase on the right, everything has been repacked really neatly. So when we take all the ideas that we deconstructed after reading, and then we are asked to analyze or interpret what we just read, we can choose to do that in a number of ways. We can try to repack it as it was. So we can start from the beginning of the reading and go through and kind of chronologically repack it back in, explaining it as we go. We can also choose to start with discussing character, a certain character, because we felt that that was the most important aspect of the book, was this particular character and how they evolved through the story. We might choose to start with symbolism or theme. And we can also bring in new pieces. So we're going to have all these different elements that we found within the text itself. But as humans, we also have our own ideas and thoughts and opinions and experiences. So it's very natural for those things to become part of your interpretation and analysis, so that when you're repacking, you're adding things that weren't even there in the first place. And truly, that is what interpretation, analysis, or criticism of a piece of writing is. It's taking everything that you found and then explaining it from your own perspective. So a little practice session or a demonstration just to kind of make sure that I send you out with the right idea of the interpretive work that we're going to be doing going forward in the semester. I have a little snippet here. It's actually the opening of a book called Lolita, and I'll go ahead and read it, and then I'll tell you some of the observations that I made and you might make. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. Lolita, the top of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. She was low, plain low, in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in one sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms, she was always Lolita. So first, what are some of the rhetorical devices that are present here? Alliteration is the first obvious one. Alliteration is when we see a series of words all starting with the same letter. So Lolita, light, life, loins. Right there in that very first line, we've got 4, right? I'm counting them, 4 L's there. So when we hear that, it's a bit of a pattern, and we can notice a pattern and wonder, okay, is this just going to be an audible pattern that we're going to hear as we read? Will it continue? And sometimes alliteration is just used to draw the reader in because it sounds nice. And when I say sounds, I do mean that. I know we read usually in our head and not out loud, but we do usually hear as we're reading. And oftentimes it's equally as impactful as hearing something read or reading it out loud, to hear it in our own heads. We see the alliteration again at the end of the second line and going into the third line, where it says the top of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down on the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. So now we've got just a whole bunch of T's all over the place. So we see alliteration twice with 2 different letters, and it definitely starts to emerge as, if nothing else, a pattern of speech or a pattern of thought for this particular piece of writing. There's also description. There's literal description describing the height of Lolita at 4'10", that she's wearing 1 sock. And sentence length is another rhetorical device that we can look at. A lot of these sentences are very, very short. So, my sin, my soul, very short. Um, Even she was Dolly at school is very short. So, these short sentences usually serve to grab our attention and indicate that the writer wants us to kind of move along quickly at a fast pace, that this is supposed to be something that is occurring quickly either in the narrator's mind or in real time. So if short sentences are used in a scene that's describing action, then that typically conveys that the action is happening quickly. If we're seeing a series of longer sentences, it usually means that it's more of an observation and it's happening a little unfolding a little bit more slowly. So that sentence length dictates how we read and helps us form an impression of what's happening in the moment when the writer is conveying it that way. We can also note the elements of fiction. And there's three main elements that are pretty easy to draw observations about in this particular passage. Those are character, plot, and point of view. And this is truly an example of the kind of notes you might take or the breakdown that you might do as you are working to interpret a story. So this is the unpacking that we were talking about. Character is Lolita. That's the first character that's been identified. We can make an observation that she seems young. She's only 4'10". She's got one sock on, and she's going to school. So we don't know how young, but it seems like it's not likely that she's older than high school age. Then we can think about the plot. There's already a little bit of plot. And my note here was that the person being described seems to have a lot of different identities, right? She's got these different names depending on where she's at and what she's doing. And almost like she's different things to maybe different people. This implied young age kind of seems to contradict with the last sentence where the narrator is saying, in my arms. And then the narrator also seems obsessed, right? There's this paragraph that is nothing but intensely focused on the girl's name. So that seems like it could be an element of the plot. It's the first paragraph of the book, so it's hard to tell, but seems like it could be a possibility, so it's worth noting down. Then we have the point of view, and in Lolita, the point of view is first person. The narrator uses I throughout, and my note here was based on the first paragraph, it feels like I'm almost inside of the narrator's mind. He, I assume it's a he, because I don't know after the first paragraph, is sharing something personal with me. That's how I feel after reading it. And there's already this intimate tone, and that was kind of set by the phrases fire of my loins and in my arms. So the observation right there that includes the quoted material is really important because when you write an interpretation of a text, you absolutely need to quote parts of that text, not entire paragraphs, not even entire sentences, although that's okay, but phrases and word choices. When you explain how something made you feel or what you think something meant, you need to reference back to the very particular part of the text that made you feel that way. That's your evidence. That's your backup and your support that helps you explain what your interpretation was. And those should always be presented in quotes and with a page number. And then just some other general observations, because it's always good to just let your mind wander off. I noticed, obviously, there's a lot of emphasis on the name Lolita and the variations. So probably something important there, and possibly it's part of the theme, or maybe it's even a symbol. So making that observation and noting it down in writing will help me remember as I go through and maybe as I finish a chapter and then recheck my notes and make more notes. It'll help me remember to keep that on the top of my mind. And then I can figure out if it did in fact mean anything and I have something to add to it, or maybe I'm just crossing it out because it didn't go anywhere. And that's okay. You don't know if you don't write it down. And that wraps up our discussion on close reading, interpretation, and analysis. If you have any questions, feel free to post them on the discussion board, or you can always email me. Thanks so much for watching.